Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Jedan je od uglednih svjetskih ekonomista današnjice i dobitnik Nobelove nagrade za 2024. godinu. Poznat je po svom revolucionarnom radu o uzrocima ekonomskog razvoja i institucijama koje oblikuju društva. Njegova istraživanja, posebno o ulozi političkih i ekonomskih institucija, značajno su utjecala na razumijevanje globalnih nejednakosti. James Robinson za Al Jazeera govori o stanju svjetskih institucija, svojoj nagrađivanoj teoriji, izazovima međunarodnih institucija i perspektivama razvoja afričkog kontinenta za budući ekonomski rast. Mr. Robinson, welcome to the program of Al Jazeera Balkans.
Thank you.
Based on your influential work exploring how political institutions shape national development, I'm curious to hear which regions or systems today you see as most vulnerable to institutional regression, whether it be through democratic backsliding, rising inequality, or the concentration of wealth in electoral democracies.
Well, that's complicated. I mean, there's sort of, democratic backsliding everywhere in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, in India, in the Philippines, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not sure, which I see as more vulnerable. It's probably the places that started with the weakest institutions to begin with, like in sub-Saharan Africa, where you can do a lot more damage. You have all these military regimes across the Sahel. So I would think that's more to do with how weak the institutions were to start with. That makes you more vulnerable when this process kind of gains momentum.
When we talk about the world, like this general, do you believe that globalization in the form we have at the moment, so mid-2025, incentivizes extractive institutional behavior? And doing this by rewarding short-term gains over long-term inclusive governance?
I don't think globalization has a particular implication for institutions kind of one way or another. I do think that, the radical amount of globalization that you've seen in the past 30 or 40 years, especially the scale of the rise of China, has created a lot of stresses and dislocations in the world. And that's part of the problem. It's created discontent. It's created, they call this the China shock in economics in North America at the moment. And this democratic backsliding is a global phenomenon, so there has to be a kind of global cause of that global phenomenon. And I guess this globalization is the most likely cause, although, you also see spreading of automation and, other things which are kind of impacting the world economy.
So it's more like a combination of different factors then?
But I think in some circumstances, globalization can move in the opposite direction. So I don't think, there's different sorts of globalization, but if you just talk about like trade integration, or I don't think that has a specific implication for institutions. It may depend, its implications depend on the moment and the circumstances and the form it takes. So, but I do think, in this current decades, it is leading to a set of conditions that are creating challenges for democracy, for sure.
Inclusive institutions as a phrase is something that you use quite a lot. So I would like to hear, just for our viewers, what are inclusive institutions and how do you see them today?
Yeah, I mean, by institutions, I just mean the sort of rules in society that create patterns of incentives and constraints and opportunities that kind of channel people's energies in one direction or another direction. And by inclusive institutions, I mean institutions which create broad-based incentives and opportunities that kind of have a level playing field so that people can take advantage of their talents and skills and their opportunities and develop their life projects and start a business or become an artist or whatever they want to do, and there aren't barriers or impediments or restrictions in their way. That's what we mean by kind of inclusive.
And when you put them in reality, to give us like an example, how would you rate the inclusiveness of institutions today?
Well, let me give you an example of extractive institutions, which is very clear. Think about like North Korea. So one of the examples we use in our book is the difference between North Korea and South Korea. So in North Korea, no one has opportunities or incentives except, members of the ruling Communist Party. Most people in the population, they have no property rights. They have no access to anything unless the Communist Party allows them to have access to it. Their lives are controlled, So that's the opposite of inclusion. That's not broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities. That's incentives and opportunities very narrowly concentrated in the hands of the powerful. So maybe that's a better way of seeing the idea.
What correlation is the level of inclusiveness of an institution in this digital AI era that we live in? Is there any connection there?
Well, I think we're all struggling with that. I think artificial intelligence has the potential to be, enormously synergetic with people's talents. I'm trying to use artificial intelligence in my work. How am I trying to use it? I'm trying to use it to make me more productive, to take over boring, repetitive tasks that I could do myself, but it would take me time, and it detracts from thinking and other things. So I think that's the right way to think about artificial intelligence. Clearly artificial intelligence is going to eliminate some sort of jobs, but some sort of jobs are always being eliminated. If you look at what jobs people do today, like your job didn't exist in the past. It was created. These people's jobs, it didn't exist. It's the new job. Most people today do jobs that didn't exist 50 years ago. So the world changes, jobs change, occupations change. AI will have a big impact on that. But it worries me that it's being developed without anybody thinking through the social consequences. These tech companies that are doing it, they don't care about the social consequences, and that worries me. But I think as a tool, it has immense potential for making people more productive and more creative and being complementary with humans, not just a substitute for them.
I just want to add, along your argument, every revolution we had, industrial, digital, every one that we had always meant a loss of one type of jobs,
yes,
and then
absolutely.
Creation of
yes.
a new batch.
Yes, absolutely.
Cycles.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, speaking of that, in the volatile global economy that we're living in at the moment, what kind of institutional regulation do you consider optimal, and why, for balancing innovation with long-term economic inclusion? Why am I asking this? How much regulation is wishful?
Well, that's a very big, complicated question.
So
I don't think that leads itself to a simple answer. I think, for example, there's a big role for trying to come to terms with the social consequences of AI. I think a lot of the way that AI is being developed, for example, in the United States, is very conditional on the kind of American model of capitalism, which is kind of, let's get rid of workers, let's substitute, let's kind of get wages down. This very, but there's no reason why AI can't complement people rather than substitute. That's just the kind of mentality of American capitalism. So that I find, very, very disturbing. Can one solve that problem through regulation? I don't know. People are thinking about that. I think it's a moving target. It's very, at the moment, it's completely unregulated, more or less. And, and to the extent that there is regulation, anything to do with military applications is like unregulated, basically. So robotic soldiers, drones, like whatever, that's also completely frightening to me. The military uses of this are just kind of staggering. That's completely unregulated. It's like an open field.
And it's being practiced in reality at the moment, this AI in warfare.
Absolutely. It's happening every day on the battlefield in Ukraine, for example. Yes.
When we speak about these, you mentioned sub-Saharan Africa, so some of these systems that are politically unstable, but perhaps resource-rich nations. We can take an example of DRC or Venezuela in Latin America. Can these societies their institutions, can they be reformed without a crisis or collapse?
Well, there have been plenty of crises and even collapses in the case of DRC, you know, since independence. I think it's just a very challenging political economy problem, you know, to build institutions in Congo. You know, Congo is not a country, it's a sort of archipelago. You know, it's made up of hundreds of different societies. There's no roads in Congo. You know, there's hardly any domestic air flights. Also, I've worked a lot in Congo. I've worked in Congo for 15 years. It's just very challenging getting from one place to another place. You know, you have very strong regional identities, and so there's no kind of project, really. There's no political project has ever got off the ground to build some collective understanding or some collective project or some real national identity. Ironically enough, the closest that's ever happened was when President Mobutu was there. You know, the late 1960s, early 1970s, President Mobutu got closest to having such a strategy to kind of bring together a Congolese nation. So I'm not a Congo optimist. You know, it's a beautiful country, fascinating, you know, but it's so difficult, this political problem. Very few African countries have solved that, you know, but that in some sense is the worst case scenario, unfortunately.
But you're just mentioning now these initiatives, although from a few decades ago, but at the moment we have Ibrahim Traore, who is in Burkina Faso, who is also trying to make a change, from what I reckon, bring people to these workers' actions, something which is, for me, significant or interesting, because after the World War II in ex-Yugoslavia, this is what people were brought to do, to these group work actions. So just a comment.
Yeah, I think he's interesting. You know, he's trying to tap into this legacy of Thomas Sankara, who definitely was a very genuine and interesting person. Thinker, a doer, like it was all for real, but unfortunately, you know, he was murdered so fast that it never really got off the ground. But, you know, I don't know enough about what's actually going on in Burkina Faso to have an opinion about Mr. Traore. I think it's kind of, we have to hope that the hype is true.
Okay, and since Donald Trump is a reality again this year, he came back to power this year. We're seeing this renewed tariff wars and protectionist moves. How do you evaluate this institutional logic and long-term effects, both on the U.S. economy and on global relations?
Well, I don't think tariffs have much to do with institutions, honestly. I think that's just economic policy. You know, I think it's sort of self-defeating, meaning I think these tariff policies are not going to achieve what President Trump wants to achieve. You know, they're not going to benefit his constituents. And I think he's going to figure that out, and he's going to abandon them, if you want my honest opinion. But I don't think the tariffs have much consequences for the institutions.
For the institutions?
Yeah.
It's more of a temporary...
Yeah, it's a temporary economic policy. You know, you could disagree or agree. I personally, my personal view is like what the evidence, my personal understanding of the evidence is that, you know, this will be self-defeating, you know, in terms of President Trump's own, you know, objectives. And, you know, he'll figure that out and he'll change his policy, would be my guess.
When we talk about your work, Why Nations Fail, how, if you were writing it today, would you revise it? What would you revise or add based on the past decade, the things that have happened?
Well, you know, I think, you know, I find it very difficult to study things in real time, you know, so if we were going to revise it tomorrow, I don't think we'd be adding a chapter, you know. I mean, our view is very historical, you know, so, you know, I look at the last 100 years or the last 200 years, not the last kind of 100 days, you know. So I think, you know, it's far too early to conclude, like, you know, what's the consequences of what's going on in the United States at the moment, for example. You know, I think it's too early to know what the answer to that is. I think what we point out, actually, in the chapter Virtuous Circles is actually US institutions have been challenged a lot in the past, you know, including, you know, recently in the 1930s, you know, President Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court. He kind of violated the two-term limit, you know, the term limit on the president that George Washington had set, you know, 50 years earlier, 140 years earlier, 150 years earlier. He violated that. So Roosevelt did stuff, you know, that, which in some sense is much more severe than anything President Trump has suggested. No one's talking about that, you know, but if you look at history, you sort of see, you know, the institutions have been challenged before, and that's because in some sense the institutions are not delivering. You know, they're not delivering for the average person in the United States. There's a lot of discontent, you know, and there's a lot of lack of trust, and there's problems. You know, President Trump is a symptom of deeper problems in society, and those are what we need to figure out how to address.
When we talk about the age we live in the age of digital currencies and decentralized finance, or at least their attempt to become a reality. How do you see the role of institutional monetary policy evolving regarding this new reality, and can traditional banks, central banks, remain effective?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not too much of a believer in cryptocurrency, you know, because I just don't see how it can be regulated in a way that stops it being exploited by people. You know, like when it's completely untransparent how these things are created, and there's no real democratic control over how these cryptocurrencies are created, then I just don't see, for me it all becomes like massively speculative. Like I wouldn't have faith in the value of those cryptocurrencies being maintained. Why? You know, I mean, I think this is a very old debate in economics, actually. You know, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, had this idea that privately owned, you know, privately produced money would be much better than government produced money. Like, so anything the private sector does is going to be better than what the government does. And I don't think that the evidence supports that, you know. So I think like what you've seen with cryptocurrency is actually people do take advantage of it, and they do they do act in a speculative way, and people lose a lot of money, you know. So I think the history of, you know, money suggests that you do need a government. You need the government which is accountable to its people to run the monetary system, and you can't rely on private individuals to do that because they can have very perverse incentives.
Speaking about the global situation and global current events, we have these geopolitical groups that are now, you know, becoming more visible, like the BRICS, and we see them evolve. Do you see, when we talk about institutions, institutional divergence becoming a new form of global economic fragmentation?
Well, I mean, I think the world's becoming, I think, you know, clearly we're in a moment where globalization is going into reverse. I don't think anything is going to change that. You know, I think even the Biden administration, we're already kind of accepting that. We're doing all this onshoring or friendshoring, and there's a retreat from this global economy, you know, for economic reasons, you know, and also for geopolitical reasons also. You know, there's a new kind of national security rationale for trade policy and industry policy. So I think that trend seems very likely to continue. And as I was, you know, it was happening already under the Biden administration. So it's not just President Trump who's doing that. You know, Biden kept all of these tariffs against China, for example, and he was massively subsidizing onshoring of, you know, semiconductor production and other things. So I think that's, the world is going to become, you know, more fragmented economically. BRICS, you know, I don't believe too much in the BRICS. Like Russia, seriously? I mean, Russia has no economy. Russia is like, you know, it has natural resource wealth. Its economy collapsed. You know, what sort of model is Russia for the world? You know, an expansionary empire? I mean, like what? You know, I just like, to me, that's no role model for anything. You know, Brazil, there was a moment, you know, 30 years ago where Brazil seemed to be moving into a different path, you know, development path, the rise of the Workers' Party, participatory budgeting, all sorts of interesting things going on at the local level. But I think Brazil just looks like a normal Latin American country now. That transition never happened, basically. And when the Workers' Party got into power, they became just like everybody else. You know, we call that in our book the iron law of oligarchy. You know, you just get sucked into the system, and the same extractive institutions reproduce themselves. India, you know, again, so I don't see BRICS as providing much of a role model for anything, honestly.
But do you see it as kind of a testament to the fact that people are looking for alternatives?
Yeah, I think people are looking for alternatives. But what does that mean? You know, when I go around and I talk to people, you know, they say, okay, our role model is, you know, Singapore. What does that mean exactly? You know, and when you ask them, what does that mean? What is the Singapore model? You know, like, okay, the Singapore model is we're this entrepot. We have all this fantastic location. We have a port. You know, like Singapore was never a poor country. You know, when it became independent, it wasn't a poor country. It already had sophisticated financial institutions, sophisticated infrastructure, and they created, you know, a world where massive amounts of foreign direct investment came. Okay, but there's no Hyundai, there's no Samsung, there's no Daewoo, you know, there's nothing like that. There's no Mitsubishi, there's no, you know, Honda. There's in Singapore, there's nothing. There's Tiger beer, you know. So where does all the wealth come from? By attracting all that foreign direct investment. Great model, very successful. How do you replicate that? You compete with Singapore, you try to get it to all move from Singapore to you? No, I mean, that's a zero-sum game, you know. Like the Singapore model, it's a very kind of interesting and unique model, but it's not easy to replicate that model. First of all, you have to be in the right place, you know. So you know, so I think like when you push on that, you have to sort of, when you push people on that, they kind of recognize, well, yeah, okay, yeah, perhaps, you know, or the Chinese model. What is the Chinese model exactly, you know? So I think there it's very important to get into the details of what these countries actually did, and is it replicable in my own context or in the context of another society? And, you know, usually the answer is no, because there's a lot of specificities. I like the Korean model. Yeah, I love Korea. You know, Korea isn't just like mobile phones and microwave ovens and cars. You know, Korea is like sexy. You know, it's like Gangnam Style and K-pop, and you know, it's fabulous. I was just in Korea and I learned that what's booming now in Korea is like cosmetics. They have all these fantastic cosmetics. Why is that? Because K-pop stars have this like perfect skin, and K-pop is everywhere, and everyone wants to have perfect skin like K-pop stars. So now the Koreans are into cosmetics. Is brilliant.
But it's not just Koreans. They're exporting this in the world. So you will see around Europe,
everywhere.
You will see Korean makeup and cosmetics being heavily advertised, and not just advertised. People are saying this is the good stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess they're exporting the part of the trends from Korea.
It's a fabulous country. It's so creative. It's just exploding with creativity. Korea. I love it. Yeah.
So for the end, we don't have much time left, but I want to hear about your recently won Nobel Prize for Economy last year in 2024. Do you see, what kind of comments have you received, not on the fact that you received a prize, but on the work that you and your two colleagues, Mr. Acemoglu, did with you?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, it's been fabulous. You know, it's a little overwhelming, the whole thing. You know, it was very unexpected. It's a little overwhelming. You suddenly get all this attention, all these people wanting to talk to you, but it's great for the work. You know, it's great, a lot of people paying attention. The sales of the books went through the roof, you know, so everyone's interested, and, you know, they want to do documentaries about you and they want to interview you. So it's a fantastic opportunity to get your kind of ideas out there and get your perspective on the world out there. So, you know, it's a real kind of honor and privilege, basically. You know, that's what I can say, yeah.
For the end, I know you teach, but is there any other work, such as the award-winning one that you're working on at the moment?
Well, I just finished a book on Africa, actually. I've been working in sub-Saharan Africa for 25 years. I've worked kind of all over Africa. I work a lot in Congo and Nigeria also at the moment. So I actually have written a book about my kind of way of thinking about Africa and why Africa is different from the rest of the world. But unlike most things you read about Africa, this is actually a book about kind of all the fantastic things about Africa. Like, my perspective on Africa is different from the rest of the world, but that's because Africans made different decisions, and Africans sort of chose to structure their societies, you know, in particular ways historically. That had a lot of unintended consequences, but, you know, the future doesn't have to be like the past. And I'd say, you know, there's many aspects of African society which are, you know, extremely kind of synergetic for what's going to happen. I'll give you one example. You know, African society is like based on social relations. You know, they say wealth in people. There's wealth in people. Like Africans value community and social relations above anything, you know. And so for me, like what I love about being in Africa, I realized like trying to understand myself, like why do I like being in Africa so much? It's that incredibly intense level of personal interaction. But you think about AI, what sort of jobs are AI going to remove? They're not going to remove jobs which are really human intensive. You know, why is it that you go to a hospital in England, all the nurses are from Ghana and Nigeria? Because Africans are just really good with people, you know. And a nurse, you want a nurse that is good with, has huge people skills. AI is not going to remove those jobs. So I think, that's just one example, but I think, you know, there's many examples of how, you know, first of all, you know, by the year 2100, 40% of all the people in the world are going to be Africans. You know, the majority of young people are going to be Africans. Like, you can't ignore Africa, you know, we can't ignore it, and actually we need it. You know, think about Europe. Government debt, pension systems are insolvent. You know, we need young people to work to make our economies and societies, you know, and government balance sheet viable. So instead of like building walls and doing stupid things like Brexit, we should figure out how to cooperate and how to work with the Africans and how to, you know, for me, that's like the next growth. Africa is going to grow not by making plastic ducks and shoes, and it's not going to happen the way China and Korea did it. It's going to be based on people.
We're going to end the interview with this idea and this message you had. Thank you, Mr. Robinson.
My pleasure.
Always trust. We ask the questions. What is needed in the world?